What I'd like to do with the talk today, and my goal is really to put some flesh on the bones of the arguments that President Skorton, Chairman Leach, and Professor Chosky have made about the ways in which the humanities are relevant for research on national security and for solving pressing national security problems. I'm in a position, I think, to contribute to this debate in two ways. One is that I lead something called the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project, which is funded by a range of federal grants, including our most substantial support comes from the Minerva Research Initiative, which has been mentioned several times, the DoD effort to link academic research to pressing national security concerns. The second thing, though, is that I do research in Pakistan and Afghanistan, survey research and other things, that is only made possible by close collaboration with humanists focused on South Asia. And I'm going to talk in some detail about why that link is so critical. Basically, I want to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done and then discuss this set of questions relevant to Pakistani policy, or policy in Pakistan, that we've been able to make progress on thanks to this interaction. And so the Minerva Research Initiative, to give a little background here, this is a program started by Secretary Gates and the AAU a few years back that was designed to fund research relevant in social sciences relevant to national security. And there are a couple programs here that I think are worth highlighting. One is the Terrorism Governance and Development Project, which I lead, which is studying the links between governance and development interventions that the United States and our international partners do in efforts to rebuild social and political order, places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and such, and the effects that those projects have. A second piece of research that's funded by the Minerva Research Initiative that's very relevant to national security is the CCAPS program at the University of Texas, which is studying the impacts of climate change on political stability. And so if we think about the long-range national security challenges that the United States is going to face, this is a critical set of issues. So, you know, there's a range of interesting projects here. Let me highlight a couple of things that our project has done. One is we've done a series of research on the impact of Reconstruction spending on political violence in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is a large investment for our country, about, between the two countries, somewhere between $30 and $40 billion since 2003. And of that money, it turns out that there's kind of one or two programs that have a demonstrable effect in reducing violence, and they account for about $4 billion of that $40 billion. Right? Now, it strikes me that as we're thinking about, and as people in this room are thinking about how should we spend money for national security, understanding what's worked in the past and what specific kinds of programs have worked in the past should be a key concern. The second piece of research I want to highlight is research that we've done on the effect of civilian casualties on subsequent insurgent violence. So this is a big issue in Afghanistan, particularly a couple years ago, where General McChrystal, when he took command, was struggling with the question of how aggressive should our forces be in pursuing counterinsurgency, right? Because there was this concern, there's a trade-off. The more aggressive our forces are, the more of our enemies they're able to capture or kill, but potentially the more new enemies they provoke. And so there's some optimal level of aggression that we have to figure out. And so we did, using data from Iraq and Afghanistan, a series of research on this, which identified two very important things. One was that the reaction to the mistreatment of civilians by both sides in combat is very contextual. Depends on local conditions. But in Afghanistan, in the Pashtun areas, there was this long-run negative effect when coalition forces, or ISAF forces, killed civilians. And so we briefed this research to General McChrystal and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and this was part of the, I think, part of the supporting evidence for the rules of engagement that were settled on and kind of have been trained on since in Afghanistan. The research on the Reconstruction spending has been briefed to General Petraeus. We've done a series of research over a number of years on the organization internally of terrorist groups, and that's been useful apparently and briefed at the National Counterterrorism Center, and for folks doing that. And then the research in Pakistan, which I want to focus on, has led to a series of briefings both within the intelligence community and to Ambassador Munter in Afghanistan. And this is a series of survey research that's been funded by one of the DHS Centers of Excellence, the CREATE Center at University of Southern California, that's motivated by a series of questions relating to policy in Pakistan. And there are really four that I want to highlight that are relevant for thinking about policy there. So the first is, how do actions by the United States affect local perceptions of the United States and its actions? So when we give aid money in particular ways, does that actually improve perceptions of our actions? The second is, do the actions of the United States or the actions of, say, militant groups in Pakistan, do they affect the number of people that are willing to support militant organizations that are a threat to the United States and our interests? The third is, can we take actions that make terrorist tactics in Pakistan and against the United States less lethal? So let's not forget, this is a country with which we're allied in some respects still. And they've suffered somewhere around 30,000 casualties from terrorism since 2001. So the human cost there has been massive. And so if we can understand interventions that reduce that cost, that's a good thing. And can we reduce the spread of terrorism? And the thing is that doing good work on this issue, and this really highlights Chairman Leach's opening remarks, requires understanding not the concepts we think Pakistanis are going to work with and how they think about terrorism, but understand how we think they should think about terrorism, but understanding how they actually do. And I want to give a very specific example here. So in the spring of 2009, we did a large 6,000-person survey in Pakistan in all of the 4 normal provinces of the country. And one of the questions we had on there was designed to measure support for Al-Qaeda. The problem was, when you asked people about Al-Qaeda, most of the people didn't know what we were talking about. Right? So they would say, well, what is that? And what we learned is that they understood Osama bin Laden ki Tanzim, so Osama bin Laden's militia. So the average Pakistani understood that there was this guy named bin Laden, and he had a militia, and the U.S. really hated him and was after him, but they didn't link that with this transnational terrorist organization that had committed the attacks on 9/11, right? So the valence of the organization to us was totally different than what it was to them, which means that when we have these other surveys that are informing policy where people were going out and asking, how do you feel about Al-Qaeda? They weren't actually measuring the thing that was relevant, which is how do you feel about Osama bin Laden's militia, right? How do you feel about this organization that's threatening the United States? So the area studies knowledge and the kind of deep, years-long interaction with Pakistanis that was required for us to understand that played a big role in our ability to measure support for Al-Qaeda and a number of other organizations in Pakistan. So we've now extended that to trying to understand some things like, what's the relationship between religiosity and support for terrorism or support for militant activity in Pakistan? Right? There's a great deal of concern with religious education in Pakistan, fomenting attitudes that ultimately harm the national security interests of the United States. And so we wanted to understand, what's the actual relationship, right? And it turns out that we found kind of 3 key findings that call into question the ways in which the debate about the relationship between religion and threats to the United States have played out. And so the first is, we did some research to understand, what do people actually mean when they express a preference for Islamic law in Pakistan? Right? So when they say we would like more Sharia or Sharia to have a greater role in Pakistani governance. And it turns out about 95% of the people we surveyed said basically things associated with good governance, lack of corruption, honest courts, things like that. Less than half of the respondents thought it meant anything to do with the kind of socially conservative version of Sharia that includes things like physical punishments. So the second thing we found is that measures of religiosity, except for one, which I'll talk about in a minute, had no relationship to support for violent Islamist organizations. So the extent to which people were personally religious, the extent to which they thought Sharia should have a larger role in Pakistani government, the extent to which they expressed a preference for right-wing religious parties, none of these things correlated with support for violent Islamist organizations. Right? The only thing that did, and it's critical, is an understanding of who can conduct jihad and what jihad means. Right? And so it was an understanding of what the religious doctrine said about the uses of violence for political ends that was critical. So it wasn't that people were religious or had a particularly conservative view of religion. It was that they felt that jihad should be primarily a militarized struggle and primarily conducted by individuals. And that set of beliefs about what the religion says is what predicted support for violent groups, not Islam per se. And it seems like as we're thinking about and debating what should our strategies be towards kind of public outreach and winning over this population and reducing the threat of terrorism from this country, insights like that should play a role in crafting policy, and they only come when we have a combination of two things. Generous grant funding, which enables us to do these large research endeavors that are expensive, right? Surveying 6,000 people in all parts of Pakistan takes a lot of money. But the second, and more important for purposes of today's conversation, is it takes close collaboration between the humanities to understand the details of the situation, the social sciences to know how to analyze these big picture social trends, and people who are motivated and interested in studying national security issues. And that combination is supported in many cases by NEH and the other granting agencies in the federal government, and I think is making a real contribution to national security.